We are live.
Thank you, Mr. Frederickson. This is Andy Block, School Board Director, and I'd like to welcome everybody to our April Joint Committee meeting. In the virtual room from the Board Administration is Mr. Matt Frederickson, Bill Stone, Dr. Robert Frazier, Dr. Michael Thorwart, Mr. Andy Sanko, Mr. Bill Stone, Dr. Charles Lambert, Ms. Christine Taylor, Ms. Denise Brooks, Mr. Doug Taylor, Mr. Ed Salomon, Mr. Ed Tate, Mr. Joe Hidalgo, Ms. Marianne McKee, Ms. Susan Elliott, and Ms. Susan O'Grady. And I think I saw one who's not listed on here. See one face out there?
That's Cheryl.
Hey, Cheryl. So the way this is going to work tonight is I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Frazier to facilitate the meeting. Each of the individual chairs will work with the team to provide a presentation, which will be followed by board comment or board discussion, and then the reading of public comment with items germane to that particular section. I would ask the board members to please hold off on questions or discussion until the end of the presentation or until the presenter asks. If you've got something you've just absolutely got to get out, maybe you can put your hand up there and the presenter might be able to see it. So with that, let's see how this goes. Actually, I'll make one more statement relative to public comment. Given a few bad apples ruined it for us last time around, the public comment today has been submitted and will be read by Ms. O'Grady. And I do believe we're also still taking public comment from the online website for a limited time during the meeting that will be read as well. So Dr. Frazier, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Block. Good evening to the full board, the full cabinet, and to anyone who is tuning in at home. In fact, we thank you for tuning in this evening. Certainly, we want to recognize the obvious that this is a hard time for everyone. The virus itself is certainly a worry. We know also that a lot of people are out of work right now, which is also very worrisome. And even if you are working, we know that we've added a layer of challenge for you with our distance learning program because you need to perform your job functions remotely for many of you while at the same time working with your children. I really do want to thank the vast majority of our community for a genuine sense of togetherness that has really been evident over these past several weeks. And as we have kicked off, especially our distance learning program. And I want to thank our teachers and our instructional assistants who truly, I'm just so impressed. They're working tirelessly to keep our students as on track as possible during this closure. Could not be more proud of them than I am. I've told them that, and I want to tell you the same thing. I am genuinely proud to be their colleague and their teammate. We certainly know that there's a lot of change going on right now for all of us. One of those areas of change is this kind of a committee meeting. We normally have 3 different individual committees that each meets on a different evening throughout the month. And what we're attempting to do here is to combine them together into a joint committee only for the duration of this closure. So we're looking forward to this. We're all facing different challenges, different priorities, and so streamlining this into one singular committee meeting is the right way for us to go. We also know, unfortunately, that a traditional in-person graduation ceremony on June 14th is not looking realistic at that point. Now, that said, I do want to also say that we have been and we remain committed to doing everything that we possibly can to celebrate rightfully and respectfully the class of 2020. There has been a lot of great collaboration going on between our student representatives, student government, senior class reps, and our staff. And with that has come a lot of good discussion and deliberation. And certainly we all have good outcomes here, I think, to look forward to. And some other changes include our topics of discussion here this evening. One is that our financial realities as a school district have changed drastically for the worse, as you might imagine, over the past month. So Mr. Stone this evening, once we get to the fiscal updates, will provide an overview around that. And accordingly, we went through the process, as many of you know, to develop a long-range capital plan. And so because of the fiscal concerns that we have, certainly we do need to revisit some of that capital planning work and a schedule around it. And Mr. Taylor will be walking us through that this evening. And we will begin this evening with the fact that even our distance learning program is evolving. You as parents received an email yesterday about starting to take attendance next week. I followed up with a quick note on that today. And like I did in a note, I do want to just emphasize the why behind that, because I've gotten a question from a couple folks asking, hey, if school's technically closed, why are we taking attendance? And the answer is really pretty simple and straightforward. And that's because the Pennsylvania Department of Education still wants us to report average daily attendance. So we've come up with the most simple, straightforward, quickest, easiest way for us to possibly do that. And so, as you know, if you've had a chance to go through those emails, we will start that this coming Monday, April 20th. And then the other change is all around student wellness. You know that student wellness is at the epicenter of our strategic plan. It's at the epicenter of our thinking, of our work. And we don't want that to change now that we're in this remote learning environment. So we will be changing the model a bit, certainly continuing to prioritize student wellness throughout the week, but really doing some intentional work on Fridays to enhance that work and also give our students a little bit of a time to catch up and a brain break. And so Dr. Elliott will walk us through that part of the distance learning plan and the entirety of the distance learning plan. And Dr. Elliott, I will now turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Frazier and Mr. Block. Tonight I'm going to talk to you about our distance learning plan. You can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So in response to the statewide closure of all schools, the Pennsylvania Department of Education has asked all schools to develop a continuity of education plan to outline how the district will provide ongoing education during the COVID-19 closure. This plan should be reviewed by the board, but does not require a board vote for approval. I'll provide an overview of the plan that we are submitting to PDE tonight. In addition to this plan, we have many documents on both the Distance Learning Hub and the COVID-19 Hub, further outlining our plan to continue ongoing learning and support. Our plan is based on 6 key tenets. First and foremost, briefly shared, our plan emphasizes the main goal of our strategic plan, student wellness. Our plan targets the whole child with a focus on mental and physical health, as well as academic learning. In our plan, we prioritize time for students and our families too, to spend time on their mental and physical health. In addition to the focus of the whole child, the plan considers the unique circumstances of families. We emphasize the use of asynchronous instruction with some synchronous opportunities. Asynchronous instruction means that students or families can select the time of day that works best for them to engage in learning. Teachers prepare lessons that students complete independently. Synchronous learning, teachers invite all students to join a lesson or meeting live at the same time. We focused on asynchronous learning to be responsive to the unique circumstances and needs of our families. Additionally, our plan targets device agnostic instruction. Regardless of the device, a laptop, Chromebook, tablet, or a smartphone, our students will be able to access and engage in learning. Our approach also emphasizes flexibility and patience. We recognize that distance learning is new for everyone, our students, families, and staff, and we encourage everyone to be flexible and patient as we work together. Just as all roads lead to the brick and mortar classroom in Council Rock, all roads lead to the virtual classroom environment in which we are now teaching and learning. All staff are integral to this virtual classroom. Administrators, teachers, and support staff. All are focused on making this experience as successful as possible for all students. Finally, collaboration is a critical tenet of our plan. Staff are working very closely together to plan instruction and support student learning. Our staff are also working with families as partners to support students in this new learning environment. Next slide, please. Our plan targets instruction in all content areas and all grades, kindergarten through 12th grade. We are also prioritizing time for wellness weekly. On Monday through Thursday, we will focus instruction of new content. On Friday, our focus on student wellness will include opportunities for review, remediation, and enrichment, as well as time for mental and physical health. We have also made adjustments to the timeline for our marking periods. The fourth marking period will begin on Monday, April 20th. We made this adjustment to allow our high school students an opportunity to complete missed assignments from the third marking period due to the sudden closure of school. We have eliminated formal report cards for the third and fourth marking periods for grades kindergarten through 8th because of the challenges we all face in this new environment. And we have moved to a pass-fail grading for high school to be flexible with the challenges of the new learning environment while still providing grades which are necessary to post-secondary decisions. Teachers are primarily using one of two platforms to deliver instruction, Canvas in grades 7 through 12 or Google Classroom in grades kindergarten through 12. Each teacher has a classroom established and is using the platform to connect, to teach, to review, and to assess. Finally, as Dr. Fraser mentioned earlier, starting Monday, April 20th, we will begin taking daily attendance as per requirement to record average daily attendance through a simple form that parents and students access daily. Next slide, please. Many of the decisions we made in our plan were made in order to support the diverse needs of our students. We loaned Chromebooks to those who needed a device, and device agnostic instruction to ensure all students could access learning. The collaboration between our general education and special education teachers is an integral tenet of our plan. Our special education staff, gifted support staff, ELD specialists, and related service providers carefully reviewed individual student plans in order to meet students' unique needs through modifications and accommodations. They are regularly collaborating with teachers, staff, as well as parents to support student learning and help students meet their goals. They have been contacting parents individually to best plan modifications and accommodations. Next slide, please. We have also outlined expectations for staff and students during distance learning. These expectations align to the core tenets of our plan. Maintaining relationships with students and providing a familiar face is important both for mental health and academic success. Our staff are also planning collaboratively to support each other. They are helping each other work through challenges and meet with success. Our staff have made themselves available during the normal working hours, and they provide a weekly overview to families to help families plan around their unique circumstances. Finally, we outlined expectations for our students in our plan. We ask our students to check their teacher's classroom or courses daily for lessons and assignments. We ask our students to engage as learners to the best of their abilities. And most importantly, we ask our students to reach out to their teachers for help. These are unprecedented times. We know that if we are flexible, patient, and supportive of each other, we are going to be okay. We are a Council Rock family. We are here to help each other and encourage each other through these challenging times. Focus and structure emphasizes the importance of mental health, academic learning, and collaborative nature. We believe it is exactly the type of education we need as a community right now. With that, Mr. Tate, I will turn it to you for board questions and comments.
Thank you, Dr. Elliott. I was going to say, I liked when I heard Dr. Fraser say that this distance learning plan is evolving as well it should be. You know, this is unprecedented, and the fact that we're being flexible and evolving is a good thing. Thank you for your presentation. I like how you explained very succinctly asynchronous versus synchronous. That was good. And the last thing I'll say very quickly is that I ran into a Council Rock elementary teacher the Friday or the Sunday before school opened. And he said he and his team had been working all day Friday, much of the day Saturday, and they were still working on Sunday. I think our teachers and staff and administrators worked overtime to put this together in a very hectic time frame and under difficult circumstances. So thank you for doing that. The floor is open to board members. Colleagues, you have questions or comments?
I'll just like to note that Ms. Krista Marcel has joined the meeting.
Other comments or questions? Are there any questions or comments? Or we're going to hold all public comment and questions until the end of the 3 committee meetings, correct?
So Mr. Tate, the way we'll handle that is we'll do it one by one. So Susan O'Grady is our keeper of public comment. So she has already divided those accordingly to each of the 3 typical committees.
Right.
So Ms. O'Grady, if you are all set, I believe we have at least a couple public comment statements that were emailed in that pertain to distance learning.
Thank you.
Yes, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Very good. We do. We have 3 public comments that came into us that pertain to distance learning. The first is from Nicole Stevenson of Churchville. And Ms. Stevenson wrote that, as in quote, "I'm a parent in Council Rock School District, and I would like to personally thank all of the educators in CRSD for their dedication to our children's learning. I know this is a challenge for all of them, and they are handling it with grace and even joy. My 2 boys have been in CRSD since kindergarten, and I have a 5th grader and an 8th grader at MMW and HMS respectively. And the teachers and principals and support staff have been wonderful, gracious, and supportive, even though I have no doubt that they all have worries and responsibilities of their own. I especially wanted to mention Rebecca Grimm, Stephanie Southard, Tracy Figueroa, and Yvonne Sharon at MMW, and the entire team honor at HMS. Thank you for all you are doing. This is an unexpected event." The second comment is from Nina Long of Holland. Miss Long submitted the following: "I hope all are well. The main concerns I have as a parent, and especially as a new parent to this district, was the complete lack of technology that was taught and implemented by CRSD. This pandemic has illustrated how unprepared and primitive CRSD is in response to other school districts. All coursework should be taught not only in class, but all classes should have an online access resources. It would help not just for snow days, normal sick days for a student, as well as a global pandemic. Why aren't all students participating in mandatory IT classes on a daily basis? This should have been implemented years ago. High school students need to use technology in order to be prepared for their future endeavors. This is not the case at CRSD. Basic computer skills, IT, and basic programming need to be taught. Instead, we worry about naps and how no one owns a computer in the district. This is not a poor district in the inner city. I find it completely hard to believe that in a school district where everyone has to register their child and upload all of their personal information in line in order to register for the district, yet claims to not own a computer. It's funny. In the parking lots, there are plenty of luxury cars and kids on smartphones that seem to demonstrate otherwise. This school district is supposed to have a reputation of excellence, but it falls very short. This crisis sadly illustrates how behind it is. This lack of 21st century basics have created an educational gap. Moving forward, what is the plan for next year in terms of keeping all lessons available in both an online format and as well in the classroom? Computers must be mandatory. This is essential to keep up with the times. It is even more critical since, like the pandemic of 1917-18, coronavirus could come back again with a vengeance in the fall. CRSD needs to be proactive, not just for now, but for the future. Is the online format being kept? It should be kept and expanded upon. Finally, the third comment is from Joe Madden of Richborough. Mr. Madden wrote, "I would like an answer as to why the district was later to the game than many other districts in implementing a plan to respond to the shutdown. I am under no illusions that the flow of the educational curriculum would not have been interrupted or impacted. The issue I have is that the message sent to the kids was that in times of adversity, the only answer is to do nothing. Metaphorically speaking, I would have had no issue with the kids being asked to read The Cat in the Hat every day and write a report on it. Having them lose all sense of structure and engagement and then giving them off for spring break on top of that was, in my opinion, inexcusable. It not only left with no structure, but it left them with too much time to dwell on all the negativity surrounding them. Keeping them engaged most certainly would have been the most beneficial plan for them, both educationally as well as psychologically." Those are the three comments that were submitted for this area.
Thanks, Ms. O'Grady. Appreciate you doing that. We'll get to other public comment as it is topic appropriate as the meeting progresses. I should have pointed out earlier, I will now, for most of you, many of you anyway, this is a reminder because you're used to public comment. For folks who might be new to this process, it is not the norm or the custom during these meetings to necessarily answer questions or respond to the comments. And I think that's particularly important now and with some of those questions that are asked, because if you would, and this is for anyone out there, if you would like to have questions answered, but don't necessarily care about them being read in a format such as this one, feel free just to email us. You can either email me directly or you can email our cabinet team as a whole. That's the mechanism that we've set up during this closure. So that's simply cabinet@CRSD, it's closure@crsd.org. So please feel free to do that. All right, Dr. Elliott, nice job. Thank you. Mr. Tate, thank you for those comments. I think you are absolutely spot on. Our educators have done a tremendous, tremendous job, as I said earlier, and just so proud of the planning team that Dr. Elliott has led, work of other administrators, work of CREA, work of our tech integration specialists, our curriculum coordinators, principals, teacher leaders, all across the board. Really, I've been very, very impressed and again, proud to call them my colleagues for sure.
Thank you,
All
Dr.
right,
Fraser.
with that
Thank you,
said,
Dr. Elliott. Thank you.
all right, and with that said, we are going to transition into the second part of this evening, which is our facilities update. And for that, turn it over to Mr. Taylor.
Thank you, Robert. So we have a pretty full agenda, and it's really related to the facility improvement projects, capital projects, and some minor updates. Matt, you can click ahead, please. One more. I want to talk quickly about Rolling Hills Elementary School. I did provide an update for the board relative to this. However, it's a work in progress. We have contractors returning slowly since the board approved on or authorized on April 2nd the return of construction to this project. We held a COVID-19 preventative measures virtual meeting with all prime contractors earlier this week and had a very good conversation. We have a certified industrial hygienist working directly for the GC who will be the gatekeeper and oversee everyone entering the site. There's a specific time everyone must enter. Their temperature will be taken. There's a questionnaire relative to travel and other questions for each person. Social distancing will be practiced. Personal protection equipment will be worn. We will have wash stations at toilet rooms. There'll be hand washing regularly, daily disinfection of touch surfaces. And phasing has been revised to work in kind of separate corners of the building and work our way around the building, either morning, afternoon shifts or alternating shifts, so that we're not putting a bunch of people in one space. And there'll be some ventilation introduced to the project as well to keep the spaces as fresh as possible. And a schedule update will be prepared. There will be some costs associated with this, and the contractors have been asked to assemble those costs and get those to the team so that I can share those with the board as soon as possible. So the Soul Finestone project does remain on schedule despite the challenges that we were faced with documentation at home versus in an architectural firm, management via virtual meetings. We do have an Upper Makefield Township Board of Supervisors meeting that was postponed from April that will happen sometime in May, I hope. We have the construction documents that are wrapping up in about a week. This project will be placed out to bid, and we will receive bids on May the 21st. And the special board meeting of June the 4th is in question. If that would be necessary or not, we'll see where the bids are, and then we'll have further conversation with what the group wants to do at that point. Just a rendering of the project. Okay, new Star Center. We're working with the Northampton Bucks County Municipal Authority on the sewer planning module, and we're getting close to that piece of the approval. There is a piece of news. It does look like we're going to be required to put a signal in at this project based on feedback from the township. We were basically asked to do a warrant analysis that basically indicates that the average speed along the road at the frontage of our property does exceed 40 miles an hour despite what the posting is. And because of that, a signal would be required at that intersection. And I'll touch more on that when I talk about the project bids. We will have to talk about the documentation of that and the bidding of that, but the township is good enough to let us pull that out from the primary project so it won't hold up construction should the board decide to move forward with this project. There was a mandatory pre-bid meeting on March the 3rd, which went well. There were 35 contractors involved in that pre-bid meeting, and bids were due today. So this afternoon we opened bids for the Star Center, and we did see favorable numbers. This project started out initially with a $13.8 million overall budget. Before this went out to bid, it looked more like 14.4 million because we did include the cost of the offsite improvements, the intersection work in that, along with some other costs, and an allowance of about $150,000 for the COVID program, so the contractors can practice safe construction in accordance with CDC and OSHA requirements on this project. So they were incorporated into the budget. That being said, we received bids from no less than 5 bidders per trade, and overall, the $13.8 million budget were total project cost at $13,795,000. So we are under the original budget that we started with. The square footage of the building has increased. We've been able to address that in our budget. We had great bid competition. Some of these bids were only $5,000 apart on $1 million kind of bids, which is really tight bidding. There's a $500,000 contingency. There are $500,000 in allowances for this project, including $150,000 for the COVID program. It includes an allowance of $320,000 for the offsite signal project. And with all that, we're still well under budget. So when considering those allowances and contingencies. And there's some value-added alternates in this project as well. This includes the terrazzo floors that we've seen on some of the other projects. There's some site strategies utilizing a crushed stone building pad, recognizing should we move forward with this, the key to the phasing of other projects and finishing this on time. So we have a stone building pad that allows contractors to continue to work despite rain on the building pad. If you were to do it in the conventional way, they would have to wait for those soils to dry, which you can lose weeks and weeks of time. So we've done everything we can. There's geotechnical, from a geotechnical standpoint, unclassified rock, so that if a contractor hits rock, they own that cost. We had good values across the board. So favorable numbers, honestly, numbers that I don't know we would see even in the best of bid climates. Really surprised at where we are. So it will ultimately now be in the board's hands to make that decision. But I'm really happy with the results and proud of the team that worked together to get this done, and special thanks to Chuck along the way.
And Doug, if I just jump in there real quickly before we move on from the Star Center bidding piece. As Doug had referenced there, from a timing standpoint, and many of our folks, certainly the board, know this, that the plan next year is to move our Star Center students into the former Richboro Middle School. That'll happen sometime in the fall when Rolling Hills is ready to be moved back into. And then the domino effect with this is that you then have Hillcrest slated to go into the former Richboro the following year, and then Richboro L the year after that. So all that is leading up to the famous summer 2023 that we've been talking about from an air conditioning standpoint. So do want to point that out, that this project on its own certainly carries a lot of importance, and also because of the domino factor carries perhaps even added importance. And the other piece, and Bill Stone, Mr. Stone, feel free to jump in here, but I believe that in terms of the monies that we have already borrowed, that we're close to this number, but if we stay true to our history and stick to budget or under budget, then in all likelihood, we would not need to borrow any additional monies for this project. Am I saying that accurately?
You are, Dr. Frazier. It would be exceptionally tight. We would need to remain on budget on both the remainder of Rolling Hills and Star in order to accommodate both projects within funds already borrowed.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Mr. Taylor, back to you.
And what I should say is each one of the low prime contractors for that project has experience with the district. They've all done work for us in the past, either on Wrightstown, Newtown Middle, Rolling Hills, or Holland Middle. So we have a very good team. Should this project move forward, I'm confident in the group. The schedule for this is tight. We've lost time, as you can see on here. So we were hoping to receive these bids earlier and review these with you earlier. Unfortunately, due to circumstances out of our control, that couldn't happen. But in order to maintain an early May start and help our ability to finish this by August of 21, I'm looking for some sort of decision by the board meeting on the 23rd. And I apologize on the timing of this. I'm just trying to maintain the schedule should there be a desire to move this forward. Next slide, Matt. The synthetic turf field project for North, along with the tennis court bids, were received today as well. And unfortunately, those bids were not as favorable, nor was the interest. We only had 2 bidders total for this project, which was a surprise because we had more bidders than that at the mandatory pre-bid.
Doug, you're talking about South, sorry, aren't you? I didn't
Oh
mean
yeah, I'm sorry. This is North right now. You're right. So North, we've authorized Land Tech to return. Thank you, Andy. To return to the project, and we will at the 23rd April board meeting ratify that authorization. It's similar to what we provided for Rolling Hills Elementary School. Equipment has been delivered, and the Land Tech group is going to start on the 20th with that project. The challenge that we were being faced with on this project was that Land Tech has been held up at no fault of their own on other projects, and they are in a waiting pattern, a holding pattern to get back on those projects. Had they started a project other than ours that they've been working on, they would have been delayed at no fault of their own and been owed time by that contract and ours accordingly. So there was no assurance, and it was unlikely they would finish our project by the start of the 2021 school year. By authorizing them to start on April 20th, they have a end of July 20 completion date, which gives them several weeks of float time should they have any adverse weather to still finish this by the start of the 2021 school year. And as you know, there's PE programs and other programming and a shared field use and other things that would really be complicated should that field be held up for any reason, along with outside users at the end of the day. So we're in good shape, and that's one of the board items that you'll see next week as a consent item. Can move on, Matt. Okay, now to South. So we had 11 contractors at the mandatory pre-bid. Of those, 2 contractors bid today, which was a surprise. And honestly, we opened this in STAR, so we haven't had a lot of time to do a lot of research on why only 2. All the contractors were notified. We expected more, but maybe it's because they're tied up and behind on other projects, and their schedules wouldn't allow them to get here when they need to, because this is a start similar to Star Center. That being said, we bid this with a strategy to include the tennis courts as part of the turf bid to see if we would realize any savings. And we received 2 bids for the tennis courts that were separate at 1.5 million roughly. And the bid for the low bidder on the stadium, it gave us a price of roughly $1 million, 1.1 million. So there was a $400,000 savings to team it with the turf project. Unfortunately, even when you team those 2 projects together, we're about $300,000 over the budget. And that 300 includes $115,000 of allowances, part of which is $50,000 allowance for the COVID-19 construction measures that we have to practice on these projects. There are still additional requirements. So even considering that, we're still around $200,000 over where we had hoped to be on these bids combined. It looks to me like the biggest cost came from, when we look at the breakout number, the cost for the lighting and the scoreboard was nearly $1 million as a breakout number. So that was a very big number, bigger than I think we would have expected. The numbers were competitive despite the small count. But that's the unfortunate news as far as that bid goes. Next slide. And as I said, this schedule matches the schedule in a similar fashion from a starting standpoint as the Star Center project. So this would be on the agenda for next week, whether it would be accepted or rejected for action. Quick update on Hillcrest and Richboro, the Alternative and Clean Energy Act. Today we received some information. There is definitely interest. The Department of Community and Economic Development has asked some questions for additional information, which was forwarded to them. They have, however, they notified us today that the decisions would not be coming in May. The decisions will be coming now in July. They have pushed that response date back. So despite our efforts to get this in early, we won't know until July. But we can continue to document the project with the assumption that this may happen and hope that we'll have an opportunity to be LEED Gold certified and see hopefully $4 million of funding for these 2 projects. The schedules remain the same for these projects. Again, Hillcrest Elementary would be first, and that construction would be starting in 21, and Richboro L in 22, which is key. The June of 21 date, as Robert mentioned earlier, is the date we would hopefully move the children from the LSAC program into their new Star Center and allow us to put Hillcrest into the existing or former Richboro Middle School building. Next slide. So we had bids for Rolling Hills Elementary School and LSAC moving, and because we're not moving those programs the end of June and beginning of July, those bids are really not valid. So we're going to recommend, and it is on the agenda, to reject those bids, and I'll have to put those back out likely for a Thanksgiving break move if everything goes as planned here. And that's basically what we're saying here. You can move to the next slide. Mandatory pre-bid meeting. So we had the capital improvement projects were received in advance of the April meeting, but because of the timing of that meeting and the uncertainties and not really a good chance to review these prior to, we pushed them to this meeting. We're recommending the approval of 3 of the projects based on impact to safety or education. The first would be the north and south softball field improvements. This is a Title IX issue. This is not for any other reason, but there was a group that was concerned from a Title IX standpoint. We held several meetings and informed that group that we would address those concerns equally at north and south. So those bids were 157,000, but we worked the value engineering piece to modify the scope to save 28,000. So there'd be a change order, credit change order also approved with this project to reduce the value of that project. Not the quality, just the cost. Council Rock High School North, there have been students that drive unfortunately up the hill and access some of the athletic fields. This timber guardrail would kind of wrap from the tennis courts around till the upslope gets pretty steep, which will deter vehicles from accessing fields. The next closest number on this bid was 75,000 and another around 100,000. The bidder is comfortable with their number. It's a great value and it adds safety to that site for anyone that might be walking around or using fields and a vehicle would decide to unexpectedly come shooting off the hillside. And the last that we're recommending for approval is the Goodnoe Elementary School gym bleacher replacement. Right now, those bleachers in that project are original to the building. They weren't replaced when the project was renovated. We did get some additional years out of those, but mechanically, they're a challenge for the staff to use. We're worried about someone hurting themselves trying to open the bleachers and the damage to the new synthetic floor that's in the gym. So we're recommending the replacement of those bleachers. The other 3 bids are recommended for rejection. That's the admin HVAC replacement at North. The number was simply too high. The glazing replacement at South, there's a lot of windows that do need to be replaced, but we can wait until next year when we, hopefully financially things are looking a little better. And Churchville exterior lighting improvements, again, a project that can wait, or perhaps our staff can get to it at some point. So we're looking to reject those. Thank you, Matt. You can. And again, these projects are on the board agenda for approval for next week. The custodial services RFP, that project has been placed out to bid. We are going to hold a virtual pre-proposal meeting tomorrow at 10 a.m. There are 5 registered contractors or vendors that are going to be participating in the process. After that, there'll be questions, answers, addenda, and those professional fee proposals are due on the 30th of April. Review those at the May joint committee meeting and look for a board approval on May 21st. The transition will be June 1, whether it's Aramark that stays and transitions to a different kind of program with different staffing or a new vendor that the board considers. At that point, they'd be bringing in new chemical stations in the closets. They'd be bringing in new equipment, schedules, meetings with principals, bringing in the staffing that they need. There'll be a lot of work required for this transition. But I will say that Aramark is working with us currently to wax some floors and get buildings ready as they would have during the summer. And by the time a new vendor comes on board, there'll be about 9 schools, hopefully, that will be addressed by that point. So that will help the transition. It'll be a little less work for the next vendor in the summer. So lastly are the board agenda items that I have. The first one is the capital projects, which I just mentioned. The next would be the award or rejection of the Star Center, the South Turf, and the South Tennis Court project. Next would be the rejection of the moving. The North Turf replacement is just a ratifying the authorization. And then upcoming meetings. Again, The 23rd of April are the approval of the projects that we talked about. On the 7th of May, we'll review the custodial services. The 21st of May, approval of the custodial services. And then the June 4th special meeting is really to be determined. We'll wait to see where bids come in on Soul Finestone and have further discussion. Next. That is it.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Taylor. Mr. Solomon, you want to facilitate board discussion and/or questions, please?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Frazier, and good evening, everyone. Let me just, mention like along the lines of what Mr. Tate talked about earlier. Doug Taylor and his group, we've had buildings closed for about a month now, and the man's had his plate full. He's actively doing what he needs to do to get things done for our district, and I applaud that. And I think on behalf of my colleagues on the board, we can all say that Doug's done a heck of a job and his team to continue looking at the work that needs to be done and doing it safely. But as Doug mentioned tonight, and Doug and I spoke candidly before the meeting, the cost of doing business has gone up. We're seeing some increases in areas because of COVID. And then obviously there's the bids that came in a little higher than we expected. So, this is conversation the board's got to have. And Mr. Stone, we're going to lean on you as well to give us some insight. But I open up the floor to some board questions, and feel free to jump in.
Mr. Solomon, I've got a few questions.
Mr. Block, feel free.
Thank you. First one is around the Star Center topic, Mr. Taylor. So I've got two questions. Number one, do bids typically come in at the last minute on projects, or do they come in all through the open bid process?
No, the bids come in many times, moments before the bids are due, because certain vendors don't want to release their information early because they're worried that the numbers will get out. So contractors are working diligently to collect the numbers. Last minute, they're putting the bid sheets together, and they're submitting those bids in the final hours and many times the final minutes.
So is it reasonable to assume that the environment that we've been in for the last 4 weeks could have influenced the bids, and that leads to, why do you think we got such favorable bids on this project?
Yeah, it's funny. I agree. We ask for pros and cons. It could be a pro and it could be a con. You're just not sure what it's doing. But I would say that there is certainly a chance that what's happened these last several weeks, and as it continues to the quarantines continue and the restrictions continue, that contractors may be growing more concerned, and maybe that's why we saw the favorable numbers on Star Center, and hopefully we'll see the same thing on Soul Finestone.
Okay, and then a couple questions relative to South Turf bids. You mentioned the scoreboard together with the lights. Are those two tied together? And if we could cut one of those, what savings would we get if we didn't do the scoreboard, if it's even possible? Just out of curiosity.
Yeah, you could certainly remove the scoreboard. It's probably, $80,000 of that larger number. It's a small number of the bigger electrical costs.
Okay, but it's almost half of the overbid, if that's even the right word to use, right?
Yeah, the bids for the fields are certainly higher than anticipated. It's the savings from the tennis courts that really allow us to consider both when you team them, because the turf was probably overall, 700,000 higher than we had hoped, but the tennis courts were 500,000 lower. So that's where we're getting the delta. We're seeing a favorable add on the other piece to help us with the big project.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask you this, and I know you've only had these bids today. In your professional opinion, based on that earlier question I asked you in the environment, is it prudent to consider rebidding the job on its own, meaning the turf field?
We could certainly rebid that project and probably would have time. I don't know. We'd have to call the contractors and see. If you're talking about a rebid now, yeah, we we could do that. We just want to make sure that there's interest from the other primes, and there's no assurance that we'll see the same numbers from the low bidders the next time around. Sometimes numbers come in higher with the rebid, but it could be worth considering if there's a desire to do that. Certainly would be happy to do it.
Okay, and then I don't expect an answer to this now, again, because you have, less than 24 hours with those bids. But, just to tee it up, I've been a champion of this program from the very beginning. And I'm not suggesting at all that I'm in support of putting it off. However, given the environment and the conversation we're going to have next, you got to ask the question. So I'm hopeful that as you look at the total picture, that this still is a reasonable expense. And I'll defer that, Dr. Frazier, to you and Mr. Stone over the course of the next couple of weeks as we go through this, and hopefully we can stay the course.
Fair enough.
Thanks, Mr. Taylor.
Hey, Doug, I just want a quick question for clarification, because I know we received a lot of emails today regarding the turf. When did that RFP go out for the bidding to start?
If you're talking about north or south?
South, Doug.
South. South went out a while back. Let me see if I have the date. South Turf went out around middle of February.
Okay, so that was out and in the hands of our vendors well before we shut down business due to COVID, correct?
That's correct, and there was a lot of interest at that time.
Okay, I just wanted to put that out as a clarification in case that it was running through other people's minds. Anybody else from the board has a question?
I have a question.
Is that Mrs. Brooks?
Yes. Doug, good evening. Doug, historically, when you get 11 people to a pre-bid meeting, what response rate would you expect to see in a non-coronavirus world? Can you answer that?
It's hard to say because sometimes they learn, things about the project that either might deter them or encourage them. We, for example, had around 35 bidders for Star, and we had 22 that bid. So,
I'm just trying to understand if this is a COVID environment, outlier, like, if we had bid this a year ago, do you think, I guess it's within the realm of possibility that you'd have 11 at the pre-bid meeting and 2 bids?
No, I think you would have had maybe 5.
Okay, so, so clearly the pre-bid meeting happened prior to our, being home and all of that. And so this is a direct impact in all likelihood.
It is, and I think site work is certainly something that's been majorly affected by the stoppage, because the spring is when these guys really get started and try to get out ahead, which is why we want to do the same thing for Star Center and this project if it were considered. And they were actively working on some other projects, including Land Tech, who bid this job, and the other contractors, Blair, who did the site work for Newtown Middle School and Wrightstown. They're both very good. And they've been held up on other jobs. So it could be that some of these guys just don't want to, commit to another project, knowing they have other projects that they are already behind on elsewhere. I haven't had a chance to really have conversations. The focus was more on Star Center to try to get those numbers together tonight. I will learn more tomorrow. But you're right, Denise. I would expect to see more than 2 out of 11 at a pre-bid for sure.
Thanks, Doug.
Anybody else from the board would like to chime in?
Yeah, if I may, it's Mike.
Good evening, Dr. Thorward.
Doug, I'm gonna pivot off of what Denise said. In light of the fact that everybody's been delayed, we could get no interest in this if we rebid too, because everyone's been delayed due to the COVID stuff. So correct? I think rebidding is a roll of the dice.
Mike, it is a risk. I mean, I've had project in my old life where, you know, a project came in over budget. The owner said, let's reduce the scope and rebid the project. We reduced the scope, removed a couple of classrooms, whatever it was, put it back out to bid, and the project came in higher than it did when those classrooms were on it. So there's always a risk of going back out to bid, but you just don't know. These bids would be rejected and you'd rebid it. So these bids would be gone at that point.
Exactly.
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Thorwart. Anybody else? Okay.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Stellman. Thank you, Mr. Taylor. Ms.
you, guys.
O'Grady, do we have any public comment related to facilities?
We do. We have one public comment relative to facilities. The comment was sent in by Brian Brossman of Richborough. Mr. Brossman wrote, social distancing has caused some difficult days for all of our communities and especially our children. These tough times help remind us how important extracurricular activities are to a child's development and well-being. With the school year being completely shut down, this seems like a great opportunity to begin the CR South turf field project early. Given these difficult days, it would be an amazing gift to our CR South community to have the brand new turf facility ready to go when this stay-at-home order is finally lifted. This project is long overdue and would be widely celebrated in the community. In tonight's meeting, can you please address the CR South turf project and provide an updated timeline?
All right, thank you. And I believe that
the
was
only
granted. All right, thanks, Mr. Grady. All right, so transitioning to our third and final typical single committee, finance committee meeting. Again, a lot of what can or unfortunately can't happen in the arena of capital work and otherwise is going to be dictated, of course, by current events around the economy and the impact that that we'll be seeing and in fact already are seeing here in the district. So Mr. Stone, you may take it away.
Thank you, Dr. Frazier. We have just one agenda item for tonight's discussion here. And let me see if I can get the slides to advance. There we go. So we're going to be talking about the impact of COVID-19 on our financial situation. And we're going to be looking at it from two different perspectives. The first of which will be the impact on the current budget year, fiscal year 2019-20. And then as we are in the throes of the budget development process for next year, the timing of this virus really threw a monkey wrench into our planning. And I'll share more details on that. So we'll talk about the general consequences of a recessionary environment on school district finances. We'll talk about the assumptions that we utilized in order to recalculate some of our revenue collections. And then we'll also talk about the internal process as well as the timeline for board approval, because at this point, there is no relief from the state with respect to the requirement to approve a budget before June 30th. So we'll address those items tonight. And we'll begin with the projections for the current fiscal year 2019-20. So this is certainly not an exact science. The budget process demands precision. We have to submit a number for each of our budget accounts. We don't have the ability to say that we could come in between X and Y. We have to say it's going to be this number, which for a situation like this, where there is a tremendous amount of uncertainty, it is very difficult to make those precise estimates, but yet we are required to do so. So much of what you are going to see in this presentation is around ranges, because until this economic situation develops further, we won't know the true impact of the virus and how it's affected the local collection of real estate taxes and interim taxes and earned income taxes. So we do have to try to find the balance between ranges versus precision. And certainly the objective of this exercise is, how are we going to finish this fiscal year? That's always the the topic of discussion with regard to budget performance. What's going to be the surplus or the deficit that we can carry forward and will ultimately either add to or subtract from our fund balance. So the critical assumptions for fiscal year 2019-20 really revolve around, for the revenue budget, what's remaining to be collected. We've collected the majority of our revenues early in the year, and that's primarily because the school tax bills go out in July and are typically collected by the end of December, typically in the 98% range. But there are still some revenues that come in throughout the course of the year, and the example that we'll discuss in a lot more detail later on is that of earned income tax. Because the filing deadline for taxes is traditionally April 15th, yesterday, we received about 20% of our EIT revenue in the month of May. So we received that significant amount of money very late in the year. And so right now there's tremendous uncertainty around how much earned income tax will actually be collected. And we'll talk more about that. And I'll show you the methodology that was used to come up with some of these estimates. At the time that I was analyzing expenditures, I was using 3 scenarios. And the reason that I chose 3 scenarios is because at that point, the governor had not announced the closure of schools for the remainder of the academic year. And so there was a possibility that with reopening that we would need to have some startup expenses or would incur some additional expenses at the end of the year. So I developed 3 options. The first option was a total freeze where only essential payments are continued. So if you look at our current spend as of the end of March, you would only add those essential payments. I've mentioned 2 there, utilities and debt, that would continue and that are required to be paid in order for our buildings to remain open and our district to remain in compliance with our debt covenants. There would be minimal tuition payments paid in that scenario. And that was at a time, again, when the situation was uncertain as far as whether schools would be allowed to collect tuition. The other 2 options give you a sense of a more middle ground approach where we would continue with tuition and other contracted payments, but that supplies and equipment would remain frozen. And the 2 options are taking the current spend as of March 31st and adding 10% to that amount, which would cover the outstanding invoices where services are often billed in arrears. So we may write a check in March that is for services that were performed in February. So we are naturally going to have some catch up for services that were rendered before the closure. And so that was the thinking around option 2. The third option, again, was you can look at it in one of 2 ways. The original thought process was if we come back to school and resume operations, that there might be some additional investments in the budget that would be needed. And so I took current plus 25%. You could also look at that as sort of if 10% might be a low estimate for certain expenses, you can look at it at that potentially that's a little bit of a higher estimate. The way the model is designed, you can make a choice on which option to use for each individual account. So this is not a one-size-fits-all decision that needs to be made for our modeling purposes. You can take the books account and choose whether it's option 1, option 2, or option 3. And the objective here, again, was to try to come up with a point in time, but also to show the range of what the possible impacts could be. So this slide here shows a couple of items, and you're going to see revenue first, and then we'll dive into expenditures. They're a little bit different, but this is every revenue that the district collects and shows in the first colored column there. It shows the dollar impact. So think of a high dollar impact as something that's $1 million or more. Think about a moderate dollar impact as something that's $100,000 to $999,999, and then low, obviously being less than 100,000. So the focus here is to try to identify those items that have a high dollar impact, and then moving into the second and third columns, you can see the impact because of the economics surrounding the pandemic. And you can see it for both the 2019-20 school year, the year that we are living in right now, as well as the 2021 year, because the impact is sometimes different in different years. Obviously, we want to focus our attention on those highs. So I'll not be able to point as I would normally, but you can see on the left-hand column a number of high dollar impact local revenues that also have a high impact because of the pandemic in both 1920 and 2021. That's where we needed to put our most significant focus. On the expenditure side, these are all of our expenditures going down the left side of the column, and this is slightly different, looking at just 2019-20 as far as the dollar impact again, so following that same methodology. But the second columns, the second and third colored column there show whether or not we are required to continue to pay these items and estimated savings in the current year associated with that particular account. So and then obviously there's also some comments that could aid in your analysis. So while you're reviewing that, I'll just give you the high level of what we're looking at here. So this first top section on this slide shows our salaries and benefits. Obviously, the highest budgetary impact, highest dollar impact that we see, and interestingly, the lowest savings because of the Act 13 mandate that was recently passed by the state. We are required to continue to pay all employees their compensation for this fiscal year. So the only area where we might see some savings in salary is because we are incurring less salaries in the overtime category and the substitute category, because we are obviously not operating at the same capacity as we would normally. We have been performing very well again on our healthcare costs. I'm looking for Wood to touch here to make sure that continues, but we are estimating, not necessarily because of the pandemic, but just because of plan performance, we are expecting to see again another good year for healthcare costs, hopefully assuming no further high claimants. As we move down this table, we get into our professional services, and you can see now we're starting to move into some areas where we make partial payments. So for example, the contracted substitutes line item, that's our contract with ESS. They provide our per diem subs. They do employ a few long-term substitutes who are responsible for teaching during our virtual learning because they are in for a teacher who is on leave. So we do have a small payment continuing to ESS, but we are anticipating seeing high savings because we're not obviously incurring the cost for a substitute who does not have to come into the school building and relieve an ill teacher. And then you see further down it getting into custodial services, we are continuing to pay Aramark during the closure. That's that first line. And you start to see again that the colors are starting to change a little bit from high down into moderate. And on the right-hand side, you're starting to see some of the savings reach into the highs and the moderates. So moving on to the final piece of the expenditures, this is again, the last grouping is of our services and then down into supplies and equipment. So this is more of the smaller dollar impacts, but this is where we anticipate seeing some more significant savings. And I'll point out, obviously, the transportation contract being the most significant one. We're not currently paying first student for services. That's obviously because we are not out running the buses. That's a $10+ million contract where we estimate a significant savings on that. Tuitions are continuing to be paid. Some schools are still educating children, and so there's a requirement to continue to pay those. I'll point out that we are looking to be a little bit over budget on charter schools just because of a little enrollment spike year over year. That's the only account that I'm seeing right now that we could potentially come in over budget. And then as you move down into supplies and equipment, you're seeing that there are some high dollar accounts, particularly in the electricity and heat, but we are paying the full amount for our utilities to make sure that our buildings remain open. But we're obviously using less of that energy because we are not operating at full capacity. So that's why the savings can tick up a little bit there. Okay, so each of those decision points, those assumptions on revenue and expenditures feed into the overall fiscal impact. So what we're showing here is a comparison of the 2019-20 original budget, which, as you can see, 4 lines down, was budgeted, as has been done historically, for a $4.4 million budget deficit. And you can see each of the categories of the budget that we talked about just now. So what you're seeing in that middle column of figures, the estimate range, excuse me, is showing the better case and worst case as far as revenues go. And I've tried to help visually with showing that red numbers are bad and green numbers are good, meaning on the revenue line, for example, that we have the possibility of coming in based on my projections for the worst case scenario, as much as $6.6 million under our budget. But we could finish, if we have some better than expected collections, we could finish a little bit to the good, about $700,000. Similar process for salaries and benefits, and then the 300 to 900 objects. So obviously the savings on salaries and benefits would come from the conservative budgeting in the area, particularly around overtime and substitute costs. So we could finish with a surplus in that line item of about $1 million, or a break-even budget, more or less. Moving into the 300s to 900s, that's obviously where we have the most significant opportunity for savings. That could be as high as $9.1 million, again, depending on how the impact of this virus goes, and particularly really around some of our more significant contracts. Our spending for things is frozen. We typically freeze the budget at some point in late March, early April, and when we were closed for the pandemic, we were probably about a week and a half out from closing the budget anyway, so we closed it at that point. Not to mention the fact we can't take deliveries right now of things. So we're likely to see some savings in the 300 to 900 objects. So again, we talk about how are we going to finish, and the hope is here that the revenue losses that we might see in some of these local taxes because of the economic implications are absorbed by some of these operational cost savings. So you can see, again, this range looks pretty dramatic. It shows a possible deficit of as much as $11.3 million, moving all the way to a $6.4 million surplus, depending on if everything breaks well or everything breaks poorly. When I look at those numbers, we have talked about traditionally trying to be plus 1% on revenue and minus 1% on expenditures to get to that $4 million number. So you're not seeing too much variability in terms of percentages. The numbers are large, but the percentages don't give me too much pause that there's some reasonability to this analysis. And I think that that we came in with obviously it's very hard to pick a point in time, but these ranges generally give you a solid estimate of where we could finish. And then obviously for ending fund balance, if we end up on the minus 11 side, our fund balance would be dangerously low, less than $11 million and 4%. That's total fund balance. That would include all of our commitments. Right now, our fund balance is $22.2 million. So that would be a significant decline. But obviously, if we finish with any kind of surplus, that's going to add to that budget and help. The fund balance in these times is what we need to rely on to maintain our credit rating and also maintain our operations. That's probably a good point to pause before we jump into budget development. If Ms. Marcel, if you're okay to take questions on that, or shall I continue?
Does anyone have questions before we continue to the next portion?
I do have a quick one.
Okay, go ahead.
First off, great analysis, Bill. Really, really helpful background. Appreciate it. Is there any, in the current environment, any savings potentially on our debt service with the cost of money being so low?
The debt market has been exceptionally volatile And the conversations that I've had with PFM, they're very hesitant to go out to market at this point in time, just because they're seeing some market behavior that's unusual. It's not following the trends that it normally follows. It's there's some things are acting in inverse relationships, and it's they're having a difficult time predicting whether or not the sales would go well. They've had some clients that have done very well. They've had some clients that have done very poorly. So it makes it very difficult to analyze. I mean, so as far as refinancings, we are current, and we were fortunate to get out to market and get a refinancing done before the pandemic. We did so in January, so that was fortunate, and that's already been factored in.
Excellent, thank you.
Yep.
Are there other questions from the board before Mr. Stone continues?
Ms. Marcel, it's Mary Ann McKee, if I may.
Sure, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Stone, for that presentation. My question is this, you know, the state has revised some of the requirements for school districts. I'm just curious, is there any indication that they might extend the deadline for submitting the budget? I mean, as you referenced, our EIT revenue doesn't come until May, and since that has such a high dollar impact and a high impact risk, would that be beneficial to us? And have you heard anything from the state about that?
I have not. I've not heard any conversation at the state level about extending the budget approval deadlines. So I'm not anticipating that they would take that action. It's part of the reason why this is such an uncertain environment, is that
Right.
that would be very helpful, and but I don't anticipate that it will happen.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Ms. McKee. Are there any other questions or comments? Okay, I think Mr. Stone, you can continue.
Thank you, Ms. Marcel. So I'm going to transition now into the budget development process, which we started in earnest last month. I'm going to talk about a few things here. And again, we're trying to answer that question in the thought bubble here. What is the impact of COVID-19 on budget development for next year? So we'll go through the general consequences that typically happen in a recessionary environment. We'll talk about the adjustments to the baseline expectations, and I will show you how we've estimated our revenue figures for the next year's budget using some prior year data, and also how we are planning for the budget reductions that are going to be necessary. So first, I'll talk briefly about what happens in a recession. So a few items of importance here. So in the Act 1 index, which, as the board well knows, is the factor by which the board is able to raise real estate taxes and the maximum allowed. Recently, that's been in a super full employment economy. So that index is calculated based on average weekly wages and employment costs. With a very high unemployment rate, that Act 1 index will typically decline. It was projected to be increasing, but it's likely going to decrease. Now, that impact wouldn't be until the next budget year. That would be for 21-22, because this upcoming year's index is set, but it does have that implication. The state budget, the state economy has been hit very hard with the pandemic. Their revenues are down significantly, and I read in a story that the state has only 2 days of reserves in its fund balance. So in that type of economic environment at the state level, there's possibilities of funding reductions in some of our subsidies. We've talked about local taxes, and obviously earned income tax is specifically related to one's employment. And as unemployment grows, so does the revenue collected from earned income tax shrinks. But the interesting impact for this year is the fact that the filing deadline for local taxes was delayed by 3 months. So instead of filing by April 15th, the filings are now due by July 15th, which is after our fiscal year is over. And that makes it, because 20% of our revenue would have come in May, that's what makes it very difficult to estimate the impact of earned income taxes on our budget until we see some of those final returns come in. Similarly, the occupation tax, which is levied here in this school district based on one's occupation. So we will likely start to see folks who, if their hours are reduced, they can change from full-time to part-time status, which reduces the amount of tax that they owe. Or if they become unemployed or retire, then they move into a different category and don't pay the tax. So we may see some declines there. The PSERS rate, what we pay on our contributions to the retirement system, the fund assumes a 7.5% rate of return from the stock market. And obviously, if you've been following the market, it's up and down, and it took a significant hit. So if the fund is not able to achieve its desired rate of return, that means that the PSERS fund has to call on the state and school districts, the members, to pay more into that fund. That's also a 21-22 budget implication that again demonstrates that we're going to have obviously an impact in this upcoming budget year, but this, even if it's a relatively short-term recession, could have longer-term consequences for this district. Our real estate tax collection rates, obviously, as folks become unemployed, they're less able to pay their taxes, which reduces our collection rate and reduces our revenue. But taxpayers, business owners often seek appeals during these recessionary times to reduce their tax liability. That would again be occurring in future years. It's not going to be an immediate impact. It takes some time for those items to flow through the system. It typically in recessions, folks do not retire in times of uncertainty. So the factor that we build in for attrition is not likely to follow the normal trends that we might see. It's difficult to determine whether more folks will retire or not in a recessionary environment. Moving into the next column, the ability to raise taxes during a recession comes into question because there, as I've mentioned, a number of folks may be unemployed or working less or have less income. So the board always has the ability to raise taxes up to the Act 1 index plus any available exceptions, but there is certainly a risk of doing so in the community, and I suppose I'll say a public relations risk with respect to that. The Fed reduced interest rates to zero, and consequently, because we cannot invest in anything that's particularly exotic, we are likely looking at a significant decrease in investment earnings. We also could face some challenges in this area of special education due to the new and very different virtual learning environment, where we're obviously trying our very best to meet students where they need to be, but there is some exposure on the special education side that could increase our costs. And then just kind of in general, how quickly can businesses bounce back from this economic recession? If we're able to get back to school on time, will all of our vendors be back in business? Will their supply chains be intact? Will we be able to get the goods that we need in time for the start of school, or will we be suffering some of the impacts that we're all suffering in terms of things that can't be found at the grocery store? That's possible for our business. FSMC stands for the Food Service Management Company. They are not going to make their contract guarantee this year because of the closure, and we may have to provide additional support from the general fund for those students who are on free and reduced lunch if those numbers increase with the pandemic. And then two more items: the statutory requirement to pay under Act 13 that ends on July 1st of 2020. So it will be we will have to find out from the state whether that requirement continues based on the status of this pandemic. And then I did mention the volatility in the bond market, which has been tremendous, but likely at some point to settle down. And even though it has been very volatile, interest rates are still generally favorable. But again, it's almost a day by day determination. So as we move into this budget process, we started out with on March 12th at our finance committee meeting with a $6.4 million budget deficit, which, as you recall, I mentioned was right in the neighborhood of where we had been in years past, and last year. And it was pretty much business as usual. We had reductions to make, but we were, still probably in pretty good shape. We were not anticipating anything really significant at that point. But then the next day is when the school district closed due to the pandemic, and when the recession really started to develop locally. So now, as we sit here tonight, we are looking at least a $10.7 million budget deficit instead of $6.4 million. And we've had to change from being in business as usual mode to the mode of needing to make budget reductions, and also to make those reductions in a tremendously uncertain environment where we're going to have to utilize a budget process that involves different steps and different trigger points that we may need to identify and utilize if we see during the middle of the budget year that certain revenues are coming in less than anticipated. We may need to make some reductions in midstream. And obviously that's very difficult for an organization that is very accustomed to planning and preparing and getting ready well in advance of when the year starts. We can't simply shut down the assembly line and take a break. The children still have to be educated, and we still have to continue moving along. So to develop that budget deficit estimate, I provided the board with a much more detailed spreadsheet that showed the use of a heat map and trying to identify the analogs in our recent past to determine, excuse me, to determine what the impact could be of this pandemic. So you see on the left column there, you see 20 years of earned income tax data. And you can see that it's gone from $9.1 million up to about $17.8 million last year. So when you look at those numbers, that's obviously been some significant increases, and that's due to a number of things, particularly what the number of residents that live in the Council Rock School District, plus any salary increases that they might receive. So it's difficult to isolate those variables, but what we can look to is in the year-over-year change column, try to identify how the budget was hit most and when it was hit most. So we're looking for the dark red areas to try to find when the last time we had a recession. So that year was the biggest year was 2007, 2008. So right at the beginning of the Great Recession, we saw almost a 7% reduction in the year-over-year change. So this is art more than it is science, but the purpose of this was to try to identify the areas and the years and the impact that we could replicate in this process. So that moves you over into the rainbow colored box there, which shows what we had estimated for fiscal year 2021 in the original budget. And you can see there was an increase because we had been collecting revenue at greater than what we had budgeted, and it was appropriate to bring that number up. So the middle column, the colorful column, shows different levels of changes. So there's a possibility that our revenues could bounce back, and so you see there's no change, and then moving down through various decreases. And thinking about this pandemic, the news that I've read and the economic forecasts that I've seen indicate that this is going to be a steeper decline, but that we could come out of it a little quicker. So trying to find the analog that we want to use to determine that estimate, again, because we need to come up with a point in time rather than a range. But I'm using basically, we've been closed for 3, 4, 5 weeks here. I don't have that much data yet to be able to make a determination on where we're going to finish. So that's why you see a range or a point in time somewhere typically in the middle of the range, but knowing that this could be an impact anywhere from $0 all the way down to a negative $3.6 million, depending on the severity of this. So what we're trying to do is show what the impact overall could be by picking that point in time, but then again using a range, which I'll show in the next couple of slides. And we focus primarily on revenue, because right now that's the impact that we'll see most. Our expenditures are a little less sensitive to the economy, but the revenue is very sensitive to what could happen. So we're focused primarily on revenue. And as I move on into this next slide here, you can see when you trace back to the impact slide that I showed very early on, you'll see most of these items on this slide here are in the high dollar impact. You can see by the amounts in the 2021 budget column, and are also highly impacted by the recession. So again, we've got to pick a number. And so that was the exercise that we were trying to do in columns 2 and 3. So taking the amount of the 2021 original budget, the first draft that I showed last month, taking that anticipated percentage change, which was based on that heat map analysis, and then calculating out what that would be in terms of dollars. And that's where you come up with the minus $4.3 million of expected impact on those line items there. As you move into the far right columns, you can see minimum and maximum exposure. And you see in the minimum exposure column that there's actually the potential for increases. And that comes about, if you recall, during the Great Recession, 08, 09, 10, 11, the federal government and consequently the state government were passing along stimulus funds to school districts. So we actually saw an increase in basic ed funding, and we also see an increase in delinquent taxes. Obviously, as more folks go delinquent, can't pay their taxes on time, that revenue source increases. On the maximum exposure side, again, those analogs that I showed you on this slide here, particularly for earned income tax, I'm estimating that minus 10%. But that number could come in as high as 20, even 30%. But I've basically doubled that estimate to try to come up with what could happen on the maximum end. And you see that could be, if everything hits the worst case scenario, we could be looking at an additional $10.3 million of a deficit that we would need to adapt to. You are not seeing on this slide real estate tax, our current real estate tax. And the reason for that is because there are three components of a tax calculation, and two of them are would see impacts in the following year because of some of the delays I talked about in the consequences section. So assessment appeals are not effective until the following fiscal year. And the other item, our collection percentage, we are already very conservative in our budget. We budget to collect 97% of our total tax levy, where we typically have finished in the 98.5% to 99% range. So there's already a buffer built into the budget where we could absorb some of that decrease if we see it naturally. And I did not see anything that was indicative of a decrease beyond where we were already budgeting from a collection standpoint. So the real estate tax impacts are going to be in 21, 22, and also depend on the severity and the length of this of the pandemic. So now here's what we're looking at here is we're looking at that original budget, and we're looking at, again, the total revenues, the total expenditures, and that deficit budget that we looked at in March of $6.4 million. And as a reminder, that all of these cases, including that original 2021 budget, assumed the maximum real estate tax increase for this year, including the exceptions, which would be 3.1%, and has a total value of about $4.9 million. So that's factored into the local revenue already. So we go to the second column, we add in those expected adjustments, which you see in our scenario that I reviewed here. That 4.3 million at the bottom in the middle column carries over onto this slide and gets added to that original budget deficit because our revenues are now projected to be less, which is how we calculate out to the $10.7 million budget deficit. our revenues coming down, but our expenditures remaining flat. So you then also see, similar to the exercise conducted in the current fiscal year, a better case and worst case, where if we were to receive some stimulus funds quickly, or our collections came in better than anticipated, better than expected, not quite as severe an impact, we could have actually a much more favorable budget picture where the deficit might be only $4.5 million. But we also look to that worst case scenario budget where if things are worse than anticipated or extend beyond, beyond the time period that the Great Recession did, we might see as much as another $16.7 million deficit that would be about 8% of our total budget. So again, we have to now start with balancing the fact that we've got a lot of uncertainty. It's very difficult to pick a point in time estimate to say we know this is what's going to happen, but yet we have the mandate to get this budget finalized and approved before June 30th. So my recommendations as far as the budget development process go, which I've communicated some of these already, is that we delay the final budget adoption from May 28th until June 18th. And it doesn't give us a lot of time, but I'll take 3 or 4 weeks of additional time to analyze this impact, and gives us as a team time to make determinations about how to make this budget work for what we need to accomplish educationally. I've mentioned it a few times at finance committees when talking in general about the budget process, but now is the time to eliminate deficit budgeting. Deficit budgeting is appropriate in good times when revenue collections are coming in higher than anticipated and expenditures are coming in lower than anticipated, but it would put us at a significant disadvantage to continue that practice. So we need to try to make that deficit go all the way to zero so that we're not starting from behind the 8 ball when we finish the year. And I also mentioned a multi-tier budget reduction plan. So if you're looking at your screen here, it's a little difficult to see, but right now I've got a couple of different tiers of budgets, and this allows us to accommodate the what ifs that we don't know. So you see in that first tier 1 reduction, the first green column, that the required reductions in that column are 6.4 million. That was our original budget deficit. So that these numbers can be updated along the way, but we can have a plan in place where we determine reductions that are going to be made and then act upon them as necessary as we review our revenue collections or our budget performance throughout the year. Now, it's a little tricky because we can't start a year necessarily with a certain staffing complement and then make those changes midstream. So we are going to have our plan adaptable enough to be able to have a staffing plan in place that we can adjust and make the budget fit within the constraints that we believe we're going to see, but that we can also have a secondary level that if we see earned income tax really taking a hit, that we might need to enact something that gets us to cover the more worst case scenario. So at this point, the decisions that we're looking at are to be in the tier 2 reduction area, which would be $10.7 million. So again, we have no choice but to pick a point in time, and that point in time that seems to be most reasonable is a deficit of $10.7 million. So our plan is to make reductions to that point and have a budget prepared that we're able to execute on that schedule that I just laid out for you, and that we would then have tier 3 in our pocket to be able to adjust midstream during the 2021 fiscal year if we had to be in compliance with our funding. And so the last slide that I have to share just shows an updated budget timeline. So in order to accommodate the delay of approving the final budget, which would move to June 18th, the proposed final budget has to be approved at least 30 days prior. And we cannot accommodate that on our current board meeting calendar. So we would need to schedule a special board meeting on May 14th, which is a night that I believe we're already out for committee meetings, but I can confirm that. And we would have just a special action meeting to take the perfunctory action of approving that proposed final budget. So that's a whole lot of doom and gloom that I've shared. It's been a particularly challenging time to try to give guidance to the folks who need to make budget decisions because of all this uncertainty. But I do think that having some flexibility in terms of the plan and the tiers gives us a way to move forward that accounts for that and is practical and doesn't take our reductions too far when we don't know the full impact, where we might. I'm hopeful to see the revenues go in the right direction, and we can make reductions that would be respectful of that and not go too far and overcut the budget. So Mrs. Marcel, that concludes my presentation, and I'll be happy to take questions from the board at this time.
Thank you. I just wanted to start with just thanking you, Mr. Stone. I know as we face these very uncertain times, I know you said you shared a lot of doom and gloom, but I think we really appreciate your work and helping us to understand our financial situation. And so I just wanted to thank you I know you spent a lot of time on the presentation for today. So thank you.
My pleasure.
Are there any questions or comments from the board at this point?
If I may.
Just same recognition. The amount of detail is fantastic. It's helpful, and even though the news isn't great, still really proud of the foresight and the detail and the work that we do. So we have some confidence in making these decisions. So thanks, Bill, for that, and the whole team that's supporting you.
Pleasure.
Thank you, Mr. Block. Mr. Tate, did you have a question or comment? I thought I heard you.
Yes, thanks, Kristen. I appreciate the level of detail, Bill. When we first started talking about this a few weeks ago, I couldn't have anticipated this kind of thoughtful detail, and it's real helpful.
Speak up, Ed.
Here's maybe an
Mr. Tate, can you get closer to your microphone? It's harder to hear.
Sure. Here's an off-the-wall question, perhaps. During an economic downturn, will we see increased enrollment from students normally attending private school?
That was not a factor that I looked at, but certainly we have historical enrollment data, and I can see if we have seen enrollment spikes. I can share anecdotally right now that most school districts are seeing the impacts of the Great Recession in terms of decreases in birth rates. So we're actually seeing an enrollment decrease because fewer children were born during tough times. So I'm not sure if we would see the migration from private to public, or whether we would see lesser birth rate impacts.
Interesting, thank you. I wouldn't want a whole lot of effort put into that, but thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Tate. Are there other questions or comments from the board? No?
All right, great. Thank you, Mrs. Marcel. Thank you, Mr. Stone. Great job. Ms. O'Grady, do we have any public comment related to Finance Committee?
Nothing relative to the Finance Committee.
Okay, then do we have any general public comment?
We do have general comment. We have one that came into us prior to the meeting and one that came in during the meeting. So I'll begin with the comment that came in prior to the meeting. This comment was submitted by Diane Lehman of Ivyland. Miss Lehman wrote, "Please allow a ceremony with just 2 ticks per family. Parents can be trusted with common sense to space their seating between couples/families. The sick stay home. The graduates can space their chairs. They space their line as they walk and don't shake hands. Just a thumbs up for each graduate by faculty and a thumbs up by the graduate. It is unfair to steal this once in a lifetime momentous occasion from our students. The numbers for this virus are nowhere near the number of deaths for seasonal flu, and doctors across the nation have admitted that they are putting down COVID as cause of death for car accident victims, etc. So the numbers are exaggerated. Be part of the solution, to use common sense, not fear. These seniors have lost enough. Please don't take the only reward and closure they have for all their hard work for 13 years. One moment. Next is a general comment from John Engelhart from Newtown. Mr. Engelhart writes, and again, this came in during the meeting. Hello, my name is John Engelhart from Newtown. I'm also a CR graduate and special education teacher in the district. I think we can all agree that our community, state, and country are facing challenging and uncertain times. The fear from the unknown and lack of information has increased stress and anxiety in our community. I'm a firm believer a person's true colors come out when they are faced with challenges. Dr. Frazier and his administration team, it has done an incredible job communicating information, continuously providing updates to the community and staff. My family and I are extremely grateful and appreciative of the leadership of Dr. Frazier and his team. It's comforting knowing that our administration is doing everything possible to put our students, staff, and community in the best possible situation moving forward. I also want to thank the school board for your concern and interest in my well-being. I sent the school board an email expressing my thoughts and feelings with how the district's administration was handling school closing. Every school board member responded, and several responded asking if I needed anything during these challenging times. People that are listening to this public comment might think this guy is being a company man for the district. While I might bleed blue and white, I also have a wife and brother who are both educators that work in neighboring districts. Our administration team is being praised by educators in other districts for how they are leading during these challenging times. Thank you. That's all the comments we have.
Okay, thank you, Ms. O'Grady. All right, I think, what time is it? 8:48?
Wow.
I think we did a pretty good job, gang. Thank you to all of you. Mr. Block, any closing comments?
None for me. Any board member with any closing comments? Well, with that, great job, team, pulling together the first joint committee meeting. Thank you, and look forward to talking to everybody at our next meeting. Take care. Meeting adjourned.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Dr. Fraser. Thanks, Robert.